Hello and welcome to another episode of our EKU Online's eCast series. EKU Online's mission is to change lives by providing access to affordable and high-quality degree programs in meaningful disciplines that positively impact our society. We thank you for joining us. Today our guest is Dr. Kevin Miner. Dr. Miner is Foundation Professor of Justice Studies at Eastern Kentucky University. His recent teaching in scholarly areas include theories of crime and punishment, institutional and community corrections, correctional law, as well as capital and other extremist forms of punishment. He chaired the Department of Correctional and Juvenile Justice Studies from 1999 to 2009. Welcome, Dr. Miner, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Steve. Good to be with you.
Dr. Miner, you've been teaching here at EKU for nearly 3 decades, and you've seen the various justice and safety programs grow, especially in the realm of online degree offerings. The college has a national reputation for excellence in teaching and scholarship. To what do you attribute this success, especially in terms of the phenomenal growth of our online programs?
Well, we've had, I think, really good infrastructure support here at EKU for distance learning historically, and then, faculty who've been willing to get involved in it and to try to develop and do the best they can with these courses. The large variety of online programs and courses that we have here now grew out of a context historically that was conducive to distance education. When I came here in 1992 and before then, the college offered various mail correspondence courses for students who could not travel to campus or didn't want to travel to campus. And then shortly after I came, we introduced satellite TV courses. Of course, those were one-way video and two-way audio. And there was a lot of infrastructure support here at that point for those kinds of courses. Later, we transitioned over to ITV courses that were two-way audio and video. Those were better. But then eventually came the Blackboard courses that we have today and their evolution. So, I think the constant along the way has been the fact that, we're predominantly a rural state and region. We have a number of students who cannot or choose not to come to campus for coursework. So we have a lengthy history now of using available technologies to reach those interested students that we wouldn't otherwise be able to reach. And now, of course, a good deal of what we do here today has national and international appeal. And with the modern internet technology we have, of course, that content can be delivered to a much wider range of students than was the case formerly.
Well, you have a reputation, Dr. Miner, as being an excellent online instructor. Would you please talk a little bit about your own journey from solely teaching in the classroom to your extensive teaching online now? What are some keys you found to effective online teaching?
Well, it's taken a while to kind of develop it and get good with online teaching. I had taught satellite TV and ITV courses, since the mid-90s with the satellite TV, but I really didn't start teaching with Blackboard until 2008. So when I prepared for that class originally, and it was a graduate level class and it had some pretty abstract material in spots, I was able to deal with some of the uncertainty and kind of anxiety I had of teaching this way by basically deciding not to do a great deal differently than what I would do in an on-campus version of the course, other than make the modifications that I needed to make, like video lectures, in order to deliver the content online rather than in person. So I tried to look at it as kind of a different vehicle, but same destination. So the online teaching I do is, I think, a good fit with the kind of teaching I've always done, and it's teaching at the end of the day. To do both kinds of teaching well, whether it's online or on campus, I think there are certain fundamentals that you got to pay attention to. You got to organize and prepare. You got to anticipate and position yourself to be in front of things. That's especially important with online teaching. You know, you got to be well read and competent in the area that you're teaching in. You got to know the material and preferably be doing research in the area. That clearly comes across to the online students as well, especially the graduate students. They're keenly aware of that. You've got to figure out methods to try to convey material that are a good fit with the material at hand. And then also simultaneously with that, how to engage the students to learn, to help motivate them and to spark their interest. You've got, and this is one of the most difficult things, you've got to figure out methods of assessment that not only fairly gauge and sample what the students have been learning about, but methods also which promote additional learning in the process. These methods of assessment should promote pedagogy in their own right. And especially important in the online environment, you need to be responsive to and respectful of the students' concerns. Where possible, use those concerns to try to help teach, to further your pedagogy. I think, at least I quickly found that you can use online teaching strategies and materials that you develop for those classes to enhance your on-campus teaching. And you can use your on-campus work that you're doing to improve your online teaching. The two are very complementary, at least they have been for me.
Very good. I'd like for us to move into your area of expertise now. You're a renowned expert in your discipline, particularly with the topic of capital punishment, which is a very complex and still, in many ways, a very controversial topic. Can you give us just a thumbnail sketch of what the main issues are that are involved in this topic?
Well, I'd categorize the major domestic death penalty issues here in the United States today as really being sevenfold. The first of these, and probably the foremost, is the historical grounding of capital punishment in lynching and terrorism, directed principally at persons of color, not exclusively, but principally. African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, Asian Americans, etc. Basically, any group that has been seen at various times and places in the past as threats and targeted accordingly. And most of it occurred, not exclusively, but most of it occurred in the American South and also on the Western frontier. And that's kind of the historical backdrop for so many of the issues in capital punishment that we deal with today. A second thing would be the complex and controversial legal framework that has developed over time, within which the American death penalty has to operate today. And this framework is defined by various statutes as well as the actions of different state and federal courts, especially the U.S. Supreme Court, which has in many ways come to what I would call own the death penalty ever since the 1970s, and increasingly so since. Thirdly, would be the various methods that jurisdictions now employ or have employed previously to cause death in a way that squares up with the legal and cultural sentiments of the particular era. The fourth thing would be concerns over miscarriages of capital justice, particularly but not only the execution of innocent persons. So concern over the sources of and remedies for these kinds of miscarriages. The fifth thing would be debates over the rationale for retaining and imposing the death penalty in the United States. These are things like retribution, incapacitation, deterrence, and cost savings. The sixth thing would be the interrelated subjects of arbitrariness and discrimination in the administration of capital punishment. The former means a certain randomness as to who gets sentenced to die and who gets executed. The latter, of course, refers to bias primarily by race, but also bias by gender and by social class. And finally, the seventh thing would be the sentiments of the American public towards capital punishment and the future of this sanction here in the United States. Now, of course, there are plenty of other important issues that are not really captured in the classification, including the way capital punishment is represented to the public by politicians, the mass media, its impact on those who have to administer it and deal with it. And, then too, there are deeper underlying tensions which shape the various issues that I've just mentioned. An example of one of those would be the age-old federalism versus anti-federalism debate in the United States.
There's something that's been really disturbing in the last 10 or 15 years that I've noticed, and that is the mass shootings and mass killings. And sometimes they're conducted by young people under the age of 18. What's your position about youth offenders and capital punishment, especially in light of Roper versus Simmons, which ruled the death penalty is unconstitutional for juveniles?
Well, historically, there was certainly no shortage of juvenile death sentences and executions in the United States. It's non-existent today as we speak, but historically that wasn't the case. In fact, 22 people executed in the modern era of capital punishment, and the modern era of capital punishment is everything since 1976, 77. 22 of those people were under age 18 at the time of their conviction offense. The youngest was 23 at the time of execution. That occurred in Virginia. And the last execution of an individual was a juvenile at the time of the offense for which they were convicted, occurred in 2003 in Oklahoma. That was about 2 years before Roper versus Simmons, that case you mentioned, which came out of the state of Missouri. That case, by the way, was not a mass murder, although people under 18 have certainly been involved in mass murders, but that particular case was not. It was a particularly heinous drowning murder involving the defendant, Christopher Simmons, who had actually boasted to his co-defendants that they could commit the murder with lesser consequence because they were juveniles. The decision itself by the United States Supreme Court was a split 5-4 decision among the justices. Justice Kennedy, who's now retired, wrote the majority opinion. And in his majority opinion, Justice Kennedy built on precedent the court had established a few years earlier in Atkins versus Virginia, which was a case that outlawed death sentences for mentally disabled defendants, what at that time was called mental retardation. And similar to what it had done in Atkins, the court pointed, to the rarity with which states in the mid-2000s allowed the death penalty for juveniles, and also to the physical and social immaturity of juveniles as factors that ought to, mitigate their accountability. The majority conclusion of the court in this case was the death penalty is unconstitutional because it's disproportionately harsh for this category of offender. The wider legal issue before the court in Roper v. Simmons, though, was whether to extend the exclusion from death eligibility the court had already established for the insane and the mentally disabled to include juveniles as well, which the court decided in Roper to do. Just a few years after Roper v. Simmons was decided, the court extended the exclusion to non-homicide crimes involving child rape. So offenses involving child rape where no one was actually killed were also excluded from death penalty eligibility. was Kennedy versus Louisiana. So the categorical exclusion issue has now become, at least in my view, a kind of can of worms for the court to deal with. It was first opened in 1986 with the issue of insanity and excluding people who were deemed to be insane at the time of their scheduled execution from being executed. So, you know, it's evolved from that to now the issue becomes, where else are we going to extend it to, if any place? By the way, the court abolished not only the death penalty, but also mandatory life without parole sentencing for juveniles convicted of homicide in 2012. And then in 2016, the court required that rule that had established in 2012 to be retroactive and thereby to apply to juvenile offenders sentenced before 2012 to life without parole. So many critics of these trends that we're talking about here sense an erosion of accountability, especially as applied to entire categories of offenders. The worry is that the impact will be to undermine things like retribution, deterrence, incapacitation. And one final point, by the way, there's now a movement underway to extend the age 18 cutoff that was established in Roper to 21 for death eligibility. That's actually a movement that in many respects got started here in the state of Kentucky.
Well, you mentioned something earlier, Dr. Miner, about the racial factor involved in many times in death penalties. Do you see a disproportionate racial population for those on death row? And if so, why do you think that exists? And is it something that's correctable?
Well, the most recent national count that was conducted earlier this year revealed that African Americans make up about 42% of death row population in the United States. Now, that's about the same percentage as whites, with Latinos comprising about 13%. What you have to remember is that all but 53 of the more than 2,600 people on death row today are men. So, and of the over 1,500 people that have been executed in the modern era of capital punishment, 34% have been African American and 8% Latino. Only 4 executed African Americans were women. And what that means is that Black men, who make up about 6% of the United States population, they account for over a third of the people who have been executed. Black men are convicted at higher rates, certainly, for homicide. So this is how some people account for death row and execution disproportionalities that I just mentioned. But I think we also have to keep in mind that Black men are victimized by homicide at grossly disproportionate rates. Yet both death sentences and executions are disproportionately likely when homicide victims are white, especially white women, and especially when defendants are Black men. In the United States, the rank ordering of homicide victimization rates is far and away the highest for Black men. It's followed by Black women, white men, and white women in that order. That's the rank order of homicide victimization rates. Black men now are killed disproportionately by other Black men. But death sentences and executions, they're disproportionately likely where victims are white and female, especially where defendants are Black men. Executions are very unlikely to occur in Black on Black homicide cases, and they're exceptionally rare in white on Black homicide cases. And researchers have studied racial bias in capital punishment. They looked at both race of offender and race of victim. Now, results are mixed. about race of offender bias. Some studies report, others do not. Race of offender bias was, by the way, cited by the Washington State Supreme Court in a recent decision in that state to declare the death penalty unconstitutional in Washington. Where studies uncover race of offender bias, it typically seems to be mostly a function of juror discretion, capital jurors discriminating by race. Studies, though, are a lot more conclusive about race of victim bias. Most, not all, but most studies that have looked at it as a topic report it. And race of victim bias seems to be more a function of prosecutorial discretion to bring capital charges against a defendant and seek the death penalty. Although racial bias is certainly an independent force in and of itself, it's very much bound up and interactive with social class bias and capital punishment, particularly negative stereotypes about poor and difficulty in getting effective legal representation. Also, in some of the research that we've conducted here, we have found that what we call the muscle memory of history and culture is important. Historically, when people could still be executed for rape, Black men were executed for this offense with gross disproportionality, almost always for raping white women. And we have found in our work that during the modern era of capital punishment, Black defendants have stood a significantly greater chance of being executed in the United States if they were in states that had higher level of executions historically for non-murder homicides, mostly sex crimes and particularly the crime of rape. We also found that Black defendants were more likely to be executed if they were tried and convicted in counties with greater numbers of recorded lynchings historically, because we have data on both of those variables. So the United States Supreme Court's precedent from a series of rulings, and the most notable ruling is McCloskey versus Kemp, which was decided in 1987. Their precedent holds that defendants who wish to claim racial bias in capital cases have to show the operation of intentional discrimination in their own cases. In other words, they can't just point to aggregate level evidence of a race of victim bias by itself. That won't suffice. I mean, they have to zero in on their own case and prove intentional discrimination there. So the larger issue is that the court has historically avoided directly confronting the issue of racial bias in capital cases, especially the issue of structural racism. It has chosen instead to address issues that are more narrow or procedural in nature, and in many cases to defer important decision makings to the states and the locales instead of laying out national precedent that would address structural racism. And, you know, some people argue that in doing this, the court has really just tacitly concealed and condoned racial bias in the death penalty under this guise of being race neutral. And that this has actually helped perpetuate structural racial injustice in the United States. I think the plain fact is this: the American death penalty clearly is born of racism and classism in this country, particularly in the South. It still displays racist and classist overtones today. So addressing the problem in any fundamental way at a fundamental level is bound up with the larger struggles for racial and class justice that we see playing out around us all over the place today in the U.S.
That's fascinating. I want to talk now just briefly about these stories that we hear on the news of a death row person proven innocent through means such as DNA testing. And in your opinion, and this is probably hard to gauge, but what percentage of people do you think are actually innocent who are now facing capital punishment? And what do we do to correct that if they are? Do we retrial every case, or what could we do to correct that problem?
Well, the short answer is it's estimated to be about 4% of the people on death row who are innocent. Let me give you a little background on this. The U.S. Supreme Court declared all existing death penalty statutes unconstitutional in 1972 in a case out of Georgia called Furman versus Georgia. The modern era death sentencing resumed then right away afterwards in 1973 when states passed revised statutes to allow the death penalty to be imposed. Since that time, a total of 172 people have been exonerated of a crime that sent them to death row. That includes 5 people so far this year in 2020. DNA, you mentioned that, it played a major role in under 20% of these cases. Now, that's primarily because it's still a relatively new technology, and also because prosecutors often fight very hard, especially on appeal, to restrict and not allow DNA testing. So this number isn't perfect, but if you look at it, it makes up about 1 to 2% of all people that are sentenced to die. So how do we get to 4%? Well, the number of innocent persons on death row is actually estimated to be about twice that 1 to 2%. The Justice Department found that almost 38% of the close to 8,500 death sentences imposed in the nation between 1973 and 2013 were thrown out on appeal due to various kinds of legal errors. Only 16% of those sentences had actually been carried out by the end of 2013. Well, when a defendant is removed from death row due to being retried or resentenced, and then they end up with a sentence other than death, say it's life without parole, for example. And here's the thing, the amount and intensity of legal scrutiny that's directed at their case will almost always diminish since there's no immediate threat of execution to drive that scrutiny and motivate it. So the urgency subsides. And the result of this lessened scrutiny is a lessened chance that actual innocence will actually be detected if it exists. So, you know, the irony is that if a person on death row is truly innocent, I mean, they didn't do it, they ended up on death row, the odds of that being determined are often quite a bit higher if they stay on death row and if their case moves closer to execution than if they happen to get off. Now, all of this takes considerable time. The average amount of time from a death sentence being imposed to execution in these 170 plus exoneration cases that I mentioned is over 8 years. So if we were to speed up time to execution after sentencing, as a lot of people have suggested we ought to do, we would greatly increase the chances of executing an innocent person. Some of these 170 plus persons would almost certainly by now have been put to death. There's no conclusive evidence that an innocent person has been executed in the modern era of the death penalty, but there have been 18 what we like to call suspect executions. And these are executions where defendants were put to death despite significant and many would say reasonable doubt about their guilt. These are well-known cases like Carlos de Luna, who was executed in Texas. He was almost certainly innocent of the crime he was put to death for. Troy Davis down in Georgia. There's an extensive list of reasons which ask about for wrongful capital convictions, including those that involve flaws in police work, prosecutorial work, the work conducted by defense attorneys, judges, even capital jurors themselves. The sources sometimes operate in interaction with one another. Research shows that the single most common source of wrongful convictions in capital cases is perjured testimony. Often this is testimony given by snitches or informants who hope to gain some kind of concession in their own cases by cooperating with the government. Another big factor is eyewitness misidentification, which is what happened in Carlos de Luna's case. Believe it or not, one of the major factors in wrongful capital convictions has been false confessions by defendants hoping to avoid death row. These are confessions given to law enforcement officials who are leveraging the threat of capital punishment during plea negotiations. And research has shown that these wrongful confessions are especially an issue with defendants who have varying degrees of mental disability. There was a very recent study conducted by the Death Penalty Information Center in Washington, D.C., which found that among the 34 death row exonerations that occurred between 2007 and 2017, the single most common reason for wrongful conviction was official misconduct by criminal justice officials. So I think the implications for correcting these and other kinds of miscarriages of capital justice are pretty clear, assuming there is will on the part of government officials and criminal justice officials to take these problems seriously and do what they need to do to abate the problem.
This is fascinating, Dr. Miner. I really appreciate all that you've been sharing with us. I'm sure our listeners are appreciating it as well. The former dean of the College of Justice and Safety, Dean Alan Alt, was a commissioner of corrections in several different states, and he was on record as being against the death penalty. And one of the reasons was because of the enormous psychological toll it takes on correctional staff and administrators who have to administer the punishment. So what are your views on this? Are you aware of any research on this perspective? And do you know if this argument has any influence in abolishing the death penalty in any states?
Well, it doesn't have the kind of influence that it should have. I think it will have more as the research becomes more abundant, but to date it hasn't had kind of impact that it should. First of all, it's an issue that's difficult to research in any reliable, valid, systematic kind of way using the type of methods we usually use. So a good deal of the evidence we have is anecdotal. It's based upon personal observations and limited interviews that have been conducted. So with that caveat, I don't think the evidence we do have leaves any doubt at all that the intentional taking of lives, whether it's in war, police work, capital punishment, whatever, can have very negative impacts on the people who are responsible. To take life as part of your job, you have to do what the famous well-known social psychologist Albert Bandura calls disengaging from your morality. In fact, Bandura and his colleagues out at Stanford studied execution team members in trying to put together this theory of moral disengagement. And moral disengagement can have all sorts of short-term and long-term ramifications, including the possibility of a person, if they do it enough, gradually coming to normalize moral disengagement in their life and then experiencing a whole range of things, harm to their physical and psychological well-being. And what we're discussing here, by the way, isn't limited just to correctional staff. It's certainly pronounced with correctional staff, but negative physical, psychological, and sociological effects of capital punishment have also been reported with police homicide investigators, prosecuting attorneys, defense attorneys, judges, capital jurors, execution witnesses, chief executives like governors, and of course, notably too, the families of victims, as well as the families of offenders. So pretty well everybody involved with a given capital case. I have a good friend, Bob Bohm, who was down at Central Florida for many years and wrote a lot on capital punishment. He calls what we're talking about here capital punishments collateral damage. And we often forget too about the scores of people who've been sentenced to die, and then later they've been exonerated of their crime, and then they're released back into the community to try and carve out a so-called life after death.
Well, some people will say that the death penalty deters violent crime. And certainly there is a specific deterrence that ensures the criminal will never commit the violent crime again. But what's the evidence for general deterrence that ensures that others won't commit violent crimes based upon this form of sentencing?
Well, the evidence on the general deterrent effect of executions is really mixed. And by the way, virtually nothing is known about the deterrent effect of imposing death sentences versus executions. And I mention that because the imposition of death sentences is an act that is far more frequent than actual executions in the United States. Some studies, ordinarily they're ones that are conducted by economists, they claim a deterrent effect. Others, these are often studies conducted by sociologists, criminologists, they claim just the converse, that there's no effect. Still other studies will cite what's called a brutalization effect, where executions are actually found to be associated subsequently with increased violence in that jurisdiction. The balance of the evidence, I would say, favors no net effect of no general deterrent effect in the net sense. Um, the balance of the evidence on balance would go that direction. Any effects that do exist seem to be relatively short-lived. In my own view, probably the best work that's been done on this topic was conducted by the National Research Council of the National Academies of Sciences. And it was conducted by a cross-disciplinary committee, sociologists, criminologists, political scientists, economists. And what this committee did was they reviewed over 3 years of death penalty deterrence studies. And they concluded in 2012, based upon their review, that commonly found flaws in these studies, which are many of which are, methodological in nature, and they're kind of beyond our scope here. But these flaws make the body of research really uninformative about whether the death penalty decreases, increases, or has no impact on homicide. These flaws create a situation where studies should not be used to inform policy decisions, the committee said. Now, this notwithstanding, there are a few what I like to call common sense observations that don't bode very well for advocates of deterrence when it comes to capital punishment. And I always try to point these out to students, get them to see that it just doesn't gel and stack up with common sense very well. The first of these is that the southern region of the United States has consistently conducted far and away the most executions, yet it consistently displays the highest murder rates of any region in the United States. Secondly, on average, death penalty states have higher murder rates than non-death penalty states, and the overall downward trend that we've seen in homicide rates in the United States since the mid-90s has generally been more pronounced in non-death penalty states than in death penalty states. The third thing is that in 7 states that abolished the death penalty between 2007 and 2017, by the way, there are now 10 states that have abolished it since 2007. Most recently, Colorado this year. But in these 7 states that I just mentioned, there were no changes in overall murder rates or murders of police officers from 1987 to 2015. So there was no correlation between abolishing the death penalty and some kind of an increase in murder of citizens generally, or police in particular. Of course, you still have people who maintain that even though the death penalty as it's practiced today probably doesn't deter as well as we wish it did, it's still worth having it, because if it saves only a few lives, or even just one, say the lives of a police officer, it's something that we ought to consider having in place.
You mentioned just now, very briefly, something about the economic factors. Some would argue that it's more expensive to the taxpayer to keep a prisoner alive for an average life term, whatever that average would be, rather than having the prisoner executed. So my question to you is, Dr. Miner, is that a fact or a fallacy? And should the issue of cost and economics even play a role in the topic of capital punishment?
Well, it probably shouldn't, but money plays a role in everything, including things it shouldn't play a role in, and it includes capital punishment. That statement that you referenced there would generally be factual. Were we talking about the death penalty in the United States before the modern era of capital punishment? So, before the mid to late 70s. In 1976, in Gregg versus Georgia, and in a variety of subsequent cases that the court handed down, the Supreme Court began requiring extra layers of due process protections in capital cases. Some people refer to this succinctly as super due process. And basically what super due process does, it drives up the costs. And these costs have escalated over the years since the mid to late 70s. It's interesting, prior to the financial crisis of 2008, these escalating costs of the death penalty didn't attract great attention. But as government agencies found themselves facing mounting fiscal pressures in the wake of 2008 meltdown, many of them started to look at their death penalties more closely and the costs associated with their death penalties. And, comparative and cost-benefit studies of capital punishment have now become almost commonplace across the United States. One of the leading researchers on this topic is a fellow named Peter Collins at Seattle University. And Dr. Collins has saved the rest of us a lot of trouble, I think, by extensively reviewing studies that have been conducted in various places since 2008 on the financial costs of the death penalty. And according to him, no credible study that he has reviewed has found the death penalty to be less costly than alternatives like life without parole. In fact, he says that pursuing the death penalty costs an average of around $700,000 more per case than not seeking it. Now, these costs mount across cases and across years. So there's a cumulative effect there that you have to take into consideration. And many people wrongfully conclude that the high costs of capital cases are due mostly to back-end expenses. And by that I mean, post-conviction appeals, lengthy stays on death row. But it turns out that upon closer inspection, these researchers find that most of the costs of death penalty are actually front-end. They're incurred during the lengthy capital investigation process, during the pretrial period, during the trial stages, expensive things like checking over eyewitness testimony, expert witness testimony, just a variety of things that drive up the cost. It's not unusual for a defendant to sit in jail 4 or 5 or 6 years before their capital trial concludes. So given all this, consider the cost to taxpayers when capital convictions or sentences are sought and paid for but they're not obtained because the jury refuses to impose a death sentence. Good example of this in Colorado. The high-profile Aurora theater shooter, James Holmes. Some may remember him. He sought to plead guilty in exchange for a life sentence. His offer to plead guilty was denied by the state. Over $5 million was put towards his capital trial, and he was sentenced to life without parole anyway when a lone juror refused to vote for death. Or consider the cost involved when a capital prosecution actually results in a death sentence, and then the death sentence gets laid aside on appeal, so that the taxpayer gets to finance the capital prosecution up front plus life in prison anyway. This is what I call, when I teach this topic, it's what I call the taxpayer double whammy. There's actually a triple whammy too. That occurs if an individual is exonerated after they've spent many years on death row, and the government is required by courts to pay a settlement to the individual. It doesn't always happen, but it sometimes does. The bottom line is this: if you want to use capital punishment these days, it's going to cost you a lot of money. Some counties simply don't have the money and therefore have declined to pursue capital prosecutions to avoid financial peril in their county, even bankruptcy in their county. And this has actually exacerbated arbitrariness in outcomes across jurisdictions, because what it boils down to is whether offenders get prosecuted capitally increasingly comes to depend on whether the county they're in can foot the bill for capital prosecution.
Well, Dr. Meyer, this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. And the thing is, I know we've barely scratched the surface of this topic. I guess I'll have to take your course to learn more. A final question for you, though, and it's really moving away from the death penalty topic altogether. If a prospective online student were to approach you and ask you why she should major in one of the many College of Justice and Safety programs, what, Dr. Miner, would you tell her, and why EKU?
Well, I would respond to her question with a question. And that question would be, are you willing to put the same level of preparation and effort into a rigorous and high quality online course that you would put into a rigorous and high quality course that meets on campus? I think it's possible to have an excellent learning experience online, analogous to what you can attain in an excellent on-ground class, provided that both, and a key word there is both, faculty and students are willing to put in the preparation and the effort to make this happen. I know a number of colleagues here and other places who've taught both online and on campus for years and believe the same thing I do, because that is what they have found to be the case. We don't aim here to sacrifice quality and rigor irrespective of instructional modality. And we have considerable experience, I think, teaching both ways. So what I would say is that work ethic overrides modality of instruction for both students and for faculty.
Very good. Well, Dr. Miner, I just want to thank you so much for your time today discussing this very important issue. And just know that we appreciate it greatly and that our listeners will certainly enjoy our discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve.